I wanted to start off and ask you, Kevin, about I guess like the visual style. When you're looking at a script and when you're looking at a story, do you think about the visual style to begin with, or does that just occur when you're actually on set?
Well, we were working on this script for 2 years or so before we got the green light to make it. So you have a lot of time to think about the visual side of it as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, the big challenge for this film was finding a structure, a simple enough structure and approach that you could tell such a complex story in 2 hours. I'm very pleased that hardly anybody has complained to me that, oh, I didn't follow it. And I think part of that is because, you know, the discussions I had with my DP and my editor about how we would differentiate those worlds, you know, the different color schemes that you use for the different formats of shooting that we used in some of the flashbacks versus the present tense and this kind of thing. So all of those discussions are sort of ongoing, but obviously they're peaking towards the period when you're actually going to shoot and you've got your DP there, you know, 24 hours a day and you're really discussing intensely.
Mohamedou, having seen the film and how absolutely horrifying and terrifying it was for you, seeing it on the screen and seeing Tahir Rahim play you and go through all those things that you went through, I mean, how do you cope with it? Like, I mean, is it hard to see it being relived?
It was very hard, to be honest with you. I couldn't like watch the scenes, the violent scenes, because we don't get to meet those who didn't survive.
Yeah.
You cannot speak to Mohamedou Ould because he died in the cold room, you know, and just like the room I was in when I was in torture.
The one scene that really, really stuck with me afterwards was when Mohamedou kind of has that mental breakdown and he's living through the memory, and it's almost kind of shot like a horror film. It really stuck with me. I'm just wondering, like, what was your kind of thinking there? Like, was it to kind of get at the sort of, I don't know, the terror and the vulnerability that it was in, or what was your kind of thinking there?
That sequence, the sequence of him going through the torture, was probably the thing we talked about more than anything else, because first of all, you're thinking, how do we show this in a way that's not going to make an audience sort of, you know, puke up or leave their seat or switch it off, but also be truthful to the experience in some way. And also, how do we differentiate this from the kind of torture that's been seen in things like Zero Dark 30, which is always kind of from the American point of view? So that was the first thing. Okay, how do we make this from Mohamedou's point of view? And then you start thinking, well, then it has to be subjective. It can't be sort of an objective reality that we're seeing of what he's going through. We're inside his head. So it's things like, you know, elongating the room, which we do at one stage.
Yeah.
And so I thought, you know, we can go inside his head and show you psychologically as best we could, and in my interpretation, what it's like to have this done to you, what it's like to be tortured, rather than here's what torture looks like. Here's what it's like to experience it. But also, it's a great relief as a filmmaker when you've had a 2-hour movie, which is, you know, a lot of talk, a lot of people sitting in rooms discussing things, to be in a different kind of arena, an arena of pure visuals, pure sound, no words really, and you've got, and you're expressing things in a purely cinematic way. That's kind of like there's a great freedom, and you can go somewhere else. And so a lot of the time that myself and the designer and Alvin Cookler, a great DP I worked with, you know, was spent discussing that sequence and how we would approach it.
You mentioned there Zero Dark 30 as the sort of thing that you wanted to avoid. I'm wondering, were there any films that you watched in pre-production or during production that kind of gave you a little bit of a, not an inspiration, but kind of were on your mind as you were making it?
Yeah, I mean, we watched, you know, various films, and for various different kind of parts of it. So, you know, you might watch Erin Brockovich to have a, you know, how do they do lawyers? How do they do small time lawyers? You might watch Zero Dark 30 to consider about how not to handle the torture. But for me, one of the biggest influences on this film was one of my favorite all-time films, which was the Battle of Algiers, the portrayed
Yeah.
film, because to me it's still the most successful and interesting kind of political film. And it also shows torture, but it shows torture in a very different way, because it doesn't dwell on it. It doesn't. It's not a film. That film is not a sort of film where you're inside the head of anyone. You're sort of on the. It's very journalistic. You're on the outside of everything, but it kind of depicts, real events and highly dramatic real events in a sort of thrillerish sort of way. You're propelled through this story, and your heart is in your throat, even though you don't necessarily get to know anything about these characters. And I thought that was fascinating for us in terms of this movie, because
you don't really know too much about Nancy Hollander. Like,
well, that's what I was going to say, is that it's the two films that I suppose were in the back of my mind in terms of Nancy Hollander and Stuart Couch were Battle of Algiers and this is the thing, the movie now I can't remember the name of it, it's gone out of my head.
Who was in it?
Spotlight.
Oh yeah,
which is another sort of issue-based film where you don't learn anything about the private life of your main protagonists.
Yeah,
and so it felt to me, and I think also to Benedict and Jodie, that this is not a film about these people. It's about the jobs that they do, and so we see them go about their jobs. We see them react emotionally in the moment to what's happened to them, but we don't really know. We have the tiniest little clues about their home life or about what they've done in the past, little tiny clues that you can piece together if you want to, but it's not about them. The person we're getting to know on a human level is Mohamedou.
The book obviously did so well and so many people read it. What's been the most surprising reaction for you, do you think?
So many people reach out to me, like flood of messages, and so
yeah.
And the film helped people. There is someone who wrote me, and there is this young man, 18 years old, and who was like, doing very bad, and he came back. He said that was like his inspiration. And so many people like that, When I watch a good movie, I want to know more about the topic.
Yeah.
When I read a good book, I want more of the same. And that's exactly the reaction I found very remarkable about this movie.
I just read a really lovely reaction from Oliver Stone.
What did he make of it? Because he can be quite cutting. I've read some of his reviews. He can really fucking dig in, like.
Well, no, he really liked it. Shall I read you what he said?
Oh, go on, yeah, why not?
So he says, several of you have urged me to see this film, which raises a poetic voice against an oppressive, censoring, and unnecessarily barbaric government. I avoided The Mauritanian because I thought it was another grim docudrama in a season full of grievances, but it plays like a thriller, alive with the truth. Jodie Foster and Benedict Cumberbatch are superb, and Tahar Rahim is an exciting discovery as a man falsely imprisoned for 14 years at Guantanamo. Director Kevin Macdonald is at his best here. The Academy mostly neglected The Mauritanian because I guess it's really embarrassing to US government, especially after the man is not freed after 7 years. But the Obama administration appeals. It leaves you on the edge of your seat. I thought, well, if that's good enough for Oliver Stone, it's good enough for me.
Yeah, if it's good enough for the lad that did like JFK.
JFK was always a big influence on me. My first ever feature, which was a documentary called One Day in September, was directly inspired back in 1999, 2000. It was directly inspired by JFK and wanting to make a thriller which operated a feature-length thriller that was a documentary.
Although it's funny, like, because when Oliver Stone talks about JFK, like, he fully admits it's a fantasy. Like, he's very like, the Warren Commission was a fantasy. I wanted to make another fantasy. Like, it's just funny that you call it a docudrama.
Yes, JFK is total bollocks, factually, but it's a fucking brilliant piece of filmmaking.
That's it.
And the first hour of it, there's probably not a better hour in American film in the 90s. I don't think it's absolutely gripping, and it reminds you of what a really great movie experience is, and I think, obviously, I'm sure you're like me, you've missed the movie experience in general, going to the cinema, but those sort of mainstream but intelligent American movies that used to be made on a big scale by the likes of Stone, by Spielberg in his heyday in the 80s and the 90s. You know, I miss those movies.